Hi there, and welcome to Crime Tapes, a podcast hosted by the School of Law, Policing and Forensics at Staffordshire University, in which myself, Professor James Treadwell, and my colleague, Kyla talk about all sorts of issues related to crime, criminal justice research, connected to Staffordshire University. This week, we're doing something a little bit different. We're doing a sort of socially distanced podcast with recording. So through the wonders of Microsoft Teams, Staffordshire University being a digital university, we've got a wonderful equipment in front of us. Connor and I thought it'd be interesting to sort of do a one-off crime tapes, but to talk about some of the things going on in the world at the moment. And in particular, to think about how criminology might sit with the response to the Covid-19 pandemic, and how criminology and sociology and social theory as subjects might allow us to think differently about the ever-changing world that we occupy right now. And I mean, when we were recording crime tapes previously, some of the things that we're talking about today just wouldn't have even comprehended the idea that, you know, we would all now be effectively showing our care and concern for others by maintaining social distance. And as we record this, the guidance is still that people should maintain social distance where possible. The recording of this podcast comes at a point, though, in the United Kingdom where there's a great deal of debate about how the COVID pandemic has already started to pan out, the differential treatment of different people, with, for example, the news breaking that Boris Johnson's special advisor, Dominic Cummings, took his family first to Durham and then to Barnard Castle. We've had the increasing death rate that now stands near in the UK to 40,000 people, and how we understand the government's reaction to that. Of course, social control has been a core part of the COVID response. Lockdown, for example, and the very fact now that many of us are experiencing restrictions and curtailments of our civil liberties that just weeks, months ago would have seemed largely incomprehensible. And those restrictions, of course, having passed through Parliament into legislature with very, very little comment, very little anxiety in some ways, because initially people felt that they should abide by the principles, and lockdown seemed to bring perhaps a spirit of unity, newfound respect for key workers and emergency service workers, clapping for the NHS. But also there are dark sides to COVID. We've already seen, for example, how global organised crime has moved to mount a kind of reaction to the opportunities that COVID present. We've seen changes, for example, at home in domestic drug markets. And of course, while we think about the positive side of lockdown, and early days for many people, I suspect it was something of a novelty. We're also now recognising, for example, that for victims of domestic violence and coercive control, that it's far from a positive experience. And we're already seeing the accounts of an increasing number of homicides coming to our attention as part of the lockdown process, particularly in the domestic sphere. So in many ways, the COVID pandemic gives us an awful lot to talk about. And yet, thus far, almost all of the discussion around COVID-19 and the COVID pandemic has been framed by health approaches or discussions of toilet paper or reactionary news reporting. And is there something more perhaps that we could offer in terms of a criminological or sociological voice on what's going on? Indeed, I think one of the things we're going to move to say is even here, perhaps, you know, where there is now the emergent sort of sociological and semiological and criminological voice, perhaps even that is perhaps a little bit restricted and only flows in some directions. And should social science be allowing us to have the kind of fullest of debates about the world we're entering into? So there's a lot to talk about. Some of it, I'm sure, will prove to be a little bit controversial, but hell, the topics are controversial, you know.
Yeah.
So that's my attempt, in a way, at a trigger warning. And all of this, I think, in many ways, also equates to a world that it would seem in many ways is in a strange process of transition. And it's worth noting for this podcast that as this goes out in the United States of America, there have already been days of riots around the death of George Floyd. And similarly, we've seen the spread into the UK and the UK having Black Lives Matter protests as well, which again perhaps confound some of the sort of logic in some way of lockdown. But even today, which is also Kyla's birthday, by the way, feel free to send her birthday wishes, but don't ask her age. She's only 40 years young. And but even here as well, you know, I think there's something interesting about this playing out, because there's very much a feeling, I think, of a world that is changing. And one of the things that people would like is some certainty and surety about where we're going. In the initial stages of the lockdown, people were quite keen to see the world go back to normal or business as usual as soon as possible, which perhaps became something of the mantra. And even now, I think it's emerging that, you know, we may not necessarily be going back, and we may have to reconcile ourselves to the fact that the world potentially may or could look very, very different in the future. I think there's all sorts of geopolitical things happening now and shaping up that are worthy of attention in the social sciences. So this is our attempt to prompt a little bit of a discussion, and perhaps a broader discussion than just myself and Kyla. Although for this podcast, whereas we're normally joined by guests, it is just myself and Kyla, and we're just going to chat about COVID. But do feel free to tweet us on our profiles at Staffordshire University. If you're following the podcast and you want to comment, that would be really interesting. We're often been told we're in an undocumented historical moment. And I do wonder, when we look back at this particular period, how people are going to remember it. Lockdown and unrest both happening at the same time. A new future or an old one? You know, are we on the cusp of a fourth industrial revolution and a better world? Or actually, might big tech and greenwashing be very much part of what's going on, and we're going to return to the old order of the have-yachts being out in the oceans, or distanced and away, whereas the rest of us perhaps face something different? Who knows? It's interesting, but that's what we're going to be talking about today. So Kyla, happy birthday, and the COVID pandemic. After Crime Tapes, quite often, and we record it, Kyla and I take a little trip to the pub occasionally. That's out of the window now. We're doing it at a distance, even on her birthday. But Kyla, the COVID pandemic, in many ways.
Where do you start? Where do you start? I'm always going to be the controversial one and sit about talking about social control and, how certain factions in this world are going to be seizing the moment and rubbing their hands together. I'm going to be talking to you about this track and trace app and say, yay, this sounds like a really bad idea, obviously. But I think the best way to do is start from the beginning. And, when this first started, I remember the whole furore around it's toilet roll for me. This whole lockdown, toilet roll, the whole world losing their mind at people stockpiling toilet roll, while Richard Branson is telling us we have to pay off his staff for him, otherwise that he's going to lose part of his business, when he stockpiled billions, and has his own island. So we get really upset about people stockpiling bog roll, but not the millionaires. They have stockpiled everything, and the sort of the measures of austerity that we've been through that have left the NHS on their knees. We spend more time. I'm going to do that. People are going to say, you don't like nurses. Yes, I love nurses. I think they're great. And if I need patching up, I will see a nurse every single day of the week. But I don't think platitudes is the way forward. If we turn people into heroes, people who are heroes have to are people who work in extreme conditions, that do adverse things. No, they shouldn't be doing that. They should be doing their job, and they should be doing their job in an environment that's safe. But instead of giving them the stuff that makes them safe, or give them the money that means that they're not using food banks for the rest of the year, we just clap.
Well, I think this is an interesting point, and if we do go back to the start, and this is something that doesn't necessarily get debated all that much, and our focus has to be global because it is a global pandemic now spreading across the world. But actually, if we begin by going back to the start of the process, we already notice in some ways that there is not a single or unified way that people interpret the COVID pandemic or the risk or the threat that it presents.
Or the rules.
So I recall, for example, although he's not being talked about now, Elon Musk was one of those people who tweeted out the COVID pandemic is dumb. I think was his line. You know, this is simply dumb. It's kind of alarmist. And yet on the other side, you had, although again, even here, if we think about Donald Trump and his reaction to the World Health Organization, but we have the World Health Organization essentially on March the 11th, confirming that COVID is a pandemic, that it's spreading alarmingly and so on. But it's never been that there has been a kind of unified response to it in some ways, is it? Because I think people filter it very, very differently in some ways. You know, we're still in a period where we don't really know about the impacts of the illness. It is so new, but certainly, you know, right from the outset, it would seem that those at risk, and risk is not necessarily borne universally. And some people were going to be at greater risk than others. But even in that initial reaction, it was very much a sort of European and Western governments concerned about the risk it presented directly to them. So how do the Chinese manage the threat of? And interestingly, I think, you know, even now we've heard very little about the global impact of COVID and what that's likely to be in terms of how inequality is spread throughout the globe. So, you know, one would, it isn't a fantasy to imagine that.
You see the privilege through, you can see I get sick of hearing this, like, COVID's a leveler. It's not a leveler. It affects people differently. This is affecting people differently. At the end of the day, it's like, you know, we've got people out there who are in privileged positions. And one of the reasons I came off social media was because I was sick to death of hearing some of my middle class mates with nice semi-detached houses with gardens. I'm one of those people too now. Banging on about stay inside for F's sake. You are killing everybody by going out. And I'm like, whoa, hang on a minute. That's all very well and good. You know, you're tweeting this or pontificating this on Facebook from your garden. What about the people who are locked up with abusers? What about the people who are sharing a confined space at the top of a tower block that are still thinking about Grenfell and the fact that these things burn the hell down, with small children who are driving them insane, and the only bit of respite they get is to go and sit in a park? And yet we are told that the people that go sitting in parks are the ones that are killing us. Now we can sit in parks. The things keep changing. It's like 1 minute it's this, 1 minute it's that. It's like yesterday, you know, we get told that they're easing the lockdown. You can have up to 6 people in your garden. But if you have somebody in your house, now it's a crime. Now it's arrestable. You can get arrested, and it's now illegal to have somebody in your house. So unless there's good reason. So what is a good reason? I don't know. You know, apparently you definitely can't meet up for a bit of.
What Kyla makes an allusion to there is the fact that, and this has been sort of well documented by, again, some commentators, that in actual fact, if you look at a strict interpretation of government guidance now, 2 people from different households having sex is now illegal. It's also the only way to continue the human race, one would assume in many instances. But hell, you know, in England and Wales at least, and there are those difficulties, aren't there? And like I said, that you know, that sort of global impact is one that, you know, if we understand now that even as we speak, really the epicenter is likely to be in, for example, South America, and you know, and the differences in opportunity. I mean, similarly, I find it a very difficult one in some ways, because people will sort of turn round to me and say, well, China have recorded no new cases now. And while I don't necessarily want to align myself with Donald Trump, you do sort of wonder whether the Chinese Communist Party will necessarily be fully telling the truth about the level of, virus and death. It hasn't exactly, for example, been very honest about the number of prisoners it executes at any point. And similarly, on that theme of prisoners, when we do get to places like the United Kingdom, for example, in the first instance, there does at least appear to be, some willingness, for example, to debate how COVID might impact upon groups like prisoners. Prisons being described as petri dishes for infection, for example. We've had in the United Kingdom reports that say the conditions in our prisons, in some of them certainly, is squalid. They're dirty. There's rodents. There's cockroaches. People in very close proximity to one another. Lack of PPE for the staff, which has become a theme in several different contexts, be it care homes, prisons, or in the NHS itself. But there was at least an initial government sort of move that we might have to do something about this. We may have to release prisoners, and then merely within a couple of months, it turns out that we have released but a handful in England and Wales, Scotland slightly more, but certainly not like some states in the United States where thousands were released. But even there, that framing, for example, is one where that fails to appreciate that the context of prisons or detention might be very, very different. For example, if you went to Pakistan or Bangladesh, or if you're talking about refugee camps on the borders of the European Union, for example. And so I totally agree with you. This notion that here we face what is the great leveler in some ways, I think is one that quickly ought to be seen for exactly what it is.
I had a bit of a conversation with a mate the other day about this, and I turned around and said that COVID might not discriminate, but society does. Society discriminates, and it's like it's like we were talking as well about the fact that like homelessness. People off the streets with a stroke of a pen, and now all of a sudden, off you go. Do you know what I mean? It's just
absolutely. And again, it shows up. I think one of the interesting things is it shows up some of those myths about what you can't do, for example, because, although we don't necessarily have this conversation, or although we should have this conversation for me far more in the social sciences, an understanding of politics and economics and political economy, we have been told, governments cannot just print cash. And then all of a sudden,
it's like
COVID comes along.
It's numbers on a screen.
Yeah, absolutely. And you absolutely can do the things that just a little while ago seemed inconceivable. The idea that you would take every homeless person in England and Wales, for example, and put them into accommodation and hotels. And yet very, very quickly, with the pandemic approaching, that became a real possibility. Those sort of statutory responses could happen. And so, even within the chaos and the concern and the anxiety, I think there was something really interesting in that, we ought to look at what it can facilitate people to do as well as can't. But back to that kind of question of, the great leveler and so on. I mean, I think everything subsequently has shown that necessarily we're not all in it together, although on Thursday nights where we clapped on our doorsteps, we might kind of like to believe we were, we might like to think that it was some sort of shared endeavour to be a lowly paid nurse in a hospital. And there's a sort of there's almost a sort of slight irony in some ways in the in the initial weeks as the death toll rose higher, the clapping became ever more ferocious and yet
I mean, don't get me wrong, I think initially when it first started it was a great sentiment, and this is where Kyla's gonna set herself out to get like piled on now. But it's come to a point where it's like it's getting a bit North Korea for me. I'm sorry, but it's like we're just expected to clap every Thursday, but not question. Because if you question what the government's doing, then it's not the right time and you're disrespectful. If you question the fact they haven't got PPE, or the fact that you didn't give them a pay rise, and you all clapped when you didn't give these people a pay rise. You stop politicising this. Well, I'm sorry, but this is the right time to be political, not the wrong time. And people say stop politicising this. Just no, you stop. You know what I mean? Absolutely stop right now. For God's sake, what's wrong with you?
It's inherently political, is it not?
Exactly. People say this is not political.
At what point is too soon? This is a sort of sentiment that, you really can't afford if you want to take the opportunity to really usher in, an important change and a full recognition of what is going on.
Society is changing, and then from my own personal experience as well. I mean, I've been doing a lot of this sort of meeting on Teams with friends and having a drink, and then this. My other half is like, I don't get it. It's weird, and I'm like, shut up, Grandad. You know what I mean? And even though he's like a few days younger than me, it's time soon. But yeah, and it's like, and I said, these things are gonna sort of come to a point where I think there's gonna be sort of like irreparable changes. It's things like, the whole. I've got a lot of friends that are, they had their kids later on in life, so they've just got little kids at home. They're all meeting up on Zoom on a Friday night. They have to get babysitters, and I think it's something that might continue. And but then there's this dark side of all this, the fact that we're not having these human interactions that we used to have. I'm sort of person, I like to go sit in the pub on a Friday after I finish work and chat on, and but then there's also the fact that it's like, I was talking to a friend the other day who is not anywhere near as conspiracy minded as me. Watch that episode, listen to that episode, by the way. And she turned around and she was like, oh, track and trace are going to trace us, and then it's going to be cashless, and I'll just switch up our bank accounts. And she was like, I sound crazy. I was like, no, you sound like me. You know what I mean? So it's like, and there is a part of you that, and I'm sitting there, I'm thinking, this is like 1984 in some ways. I mean, I was queuing outside Dunelm the other day. I thought I'd lost my soul. Queuing outside Dunelm, what is that about?
There's something very, very interesting, and again, perhaps why we should go back to look at the early and initial kind of reactions that people had, because they were, I think it's fair to say, far from universal, and now we kind of like to present it as, and I'm sure that historical memory will do this as well, wasn't it great that everybody necessarily was all, that we all pulled together? I'm sure that will partly become the
but we're not all pulling
narrative
together, are we? At the end of the day, we're spying on each other.
But that was not what happened at the outset either, was it? We got, for example, the bulk buying of some individuals. Now, we often kind of like to think that it's the people at the lowest strata of society who are the problem element. You look towards the United States.
The lowest strata of society can't afford to stockpile everything in Sainsbury's, can they?
Exactly. They're not the ones who are buying up the 48 packs to put in their garage so that they can make a profit in terms of selling them on at some point in the future. But even there, that's limited, because there's also some really interesting evidence, for example, from places, particularly in the United States, for example, of people with a great deal of sort of power and economic capital, regarding the outbreak of the pandemic as a wonderful opportunity to make more money.
Look at Jeff Bezos. He's set to be the world's first trillionaire through this, and I am sorry to say, and I hate myself for this, I've been part of this problem. I sit in my office and I'm doing things around my house, and Ava needs clothes because she's a teenager, and I'm there and I'm like, let's go on Amazon. I'm on Amazon all the time, and I've got my picture of Karl Marx. Carl's mocking me, he's looking at me with that sad little eye. I'm sure there's a tear that's developed on that picture, but we're all doing it. I mean, it's like, a friend of mine was chatting on saying, oh, don't go out. Oh, by the way, I've started the body shop. Put an order in. It's like, well, who do you think's bringing you your order? It's bringing that to you. And a lot of people are using online stuff, because at the end of the day, we are engulfed in capitalism, and we want this stuff. We're bored out of our minds. We're sat at home, the computer's there, and it's like, oh, I've always wanted one of those. I mean, some of the stuff that I've bought things to grind, like electric nail files that you have in the nail bars, because I can't do my nails myself, and I'm like, all sorts, and it's like constantly bombarding me. I have a conversation about how I need to go and get my eyebrows waxed, and all of a sudden there's 101 adverts about get some home waxing kit, and you're like, oh, I need this in my life. I can't go to the dentist, I'll get myself an electric toothbrush thingy that does all the job, so people are making a bomb out of this.
But then it's not exactly, and some people are making small amounts, but actually it's the most powerful in some ways that have the most opportunity to profit the most.
Yeah, because the most powerful have got the ability to adapt to a situation. If you've got a small business and you do what you do, you're furloughed, you can't work, you've got a small coffee shop or a pub or whatever, you're buggered. If you've got a multi-million national corporation, you can go, where's the money? I'm going to follow that. You can put your eggs out of your basket into another basket like that. The rest of us can't.
Well, here's a great, and there's a great example, because one of the early ones I read about was a chap called Richard Burr, who's obviously a US politician. He's actually chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, and he and three other senators, well, more so his wife, he's alleged to have sold between 628,000 and 1.7 million's worth of stock in separate transactions in the late January period. And the allegation is, obviously, as someone who chairs an intelligence committee and who had been given information about what was coming, that, dumping their stocks in particularly hotels, was economically a very good thing to do. And again, if we think about how
it's a misuse of power, isn't it?
Absolutely, and we often can kind of conceive of crime as being the looting, the stealing, the low level stuff. But actually, in terms of
big stuff.
In terms of where the real harm has been done, because of course that stock trade as well also harms, for example, the whole pension structure at some point further down the line. It has a huge impact that it goes well beyond the individual. And then back in the UK, one of my favourite examples, and it's one of my favourite examples because he so frequently manages to put himself in the firing line by being just by being himself, I think it's fair to say, is Mike Ashley, chairman of Sports Direct, who very quickly wanted to classify his workers in Sports Direct, the 0 hours contract workers and poor and lowly paid staff he so often relies upon. He wanted to have them classified as key workers because he sold bicycles through the stores, in effect, and recognised that people being at home more, needing the home gym, was a great marketing opportunity for Sports Direct. So he was very keen on trying to work within the government kind of legislation to essentially benefit himself.
There's been a lot, and I think what we've seen throughout this is a sort of like a shift of sentiment towards the rich, towards the mega rich. I mean, because at the end of the day, I mean, when we think of how society is structured, the mega rich are not in society. They are above society. Society does not affect them. Their lives are completely different. They don't have the borders that we have. They don't have the restraints they have. They don't even have to deal with the money the same way that we do. They are out of society. They are not part of society. So what is happening to us right now is not happening to them. What they're doing is capitalising on what is happening to us.
And it's interesting that, for in many ways, being kind of segregated off into your own home now is quite a new experience. But if we think about, for example, very rich communities, and I was watching last night on Netflix, I was watching the new Jeffrey Epstein documentary, which talks particularly about his residence in Florida and the sort of psychology that comes of essentially being on an island detached from all other people. And it made me think actually that one of the things that we saw quite quickly is people like David Geffen tweeting photographs of the fact that they were out in the ocean on their yachts. So I am so far distanced and removed because I've got everything I could possibly have, as this multi-millionaire that actually I don't need to have. And yet at the same time, there's a little bit of me that also thinks,
Did you see that awful Imagine song that was done by Gal Gadot and a load of other celebrities doing the rounds? Like, it was absolutely horrific. Like, basically we're all in it together and they're there from their mansions singing. and we're like, I think that there's a couple of rebuttal ones that went round that was like basically a load of like British sort of like comedians going basically F off, it's just like, we're not in this together, mate, really not. Do you know what I mean? We're on lockdown in our own private corner of the world. I'm just gonna do a few lenses in my personal pool, you know what I mean? I might have to clean my own cooker.
It does bring home as well that a lot of people seem to be almost kind of reveling in kind of lockdown as perhaps as an opportunity to sort of connect to some sort of experience. And one of the ones that really got me in the early phases, for example, was people taking the kind of term lockdown and sort of suggesting that for them it was almost like a kind of taste of imprisonment. No, it's not. No, it's not. It's nothing like it. Nothing like it.
Yeah. Because now all of a sudden you're locked down in your house with this big dude that's in the spare bedroom next door, and you're going to get your head kicked in if you go across your landing. You're eating crap. You might end up. You've got somebody telling you what time you go to sleep, what time you're going to use the toilet. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. It's just like prison. Shut up. There's another thing. What I've heard a lot of is basically a lot of people who are middle class people who are like, I can't believe it. The police are like asking me where I've been, and I'm a criminal all of a sudden. It's like, well, welcome to the working classes. We're growing up on an estate when you are constantly, I can arrest you if you walk from here to there, Kyla, because I know you're up to no good. Imagine, so now you're welcome to our world. And welcome to the world of many people of colour as well. Welcome to the world of the working classes and people of colour. You're being asked stupid questions. You are being treated as a criminal for just leaving your front door. Now imagine what the rest of society feels like.
We have the greatest example of that today, because the UK government have today refused to publish its report into the higher rates of deaths for BAME people under COVID. Because, and get this is the most wonderful explanation, because of the wider context that what they mean is the Black Lives Matter protests. So essentially what they're saying is that, essentially the BAME community cannot be trusted to act sensibly and read something without reacting violently. Is that the message that you want to be transmitting to society, or is it? I mean, in all likelihood, it's some of the
messages. To be fair, some of the messages that's been transmitted to society from our government over these past couple months have been absolutely shocking. Anyway,
But this is absolutely it as well, isn't it? And I suppose that the one in many ways that became almost sort of emblematic for us in criminology of so much of what we would teach and talk about in terms of the differential operation of the law was the case of Dominic Cummings, it would seem, who wonderfully sort of as an advisor manages to get himself and turn up late to a good section of garden interview to some fiercely sort of bland questions in the gardens of Downing Street, where essentially he says, well, I wasn't breaking the rules when I took my son and my wife up to Durham, or when on my wife's birthday I put my 4-year-old child in the car and drove 60 miles to test my eyesight. As we all do.
Oh yeah.
We all do. And this isn't different treatment of me compared to other people. And so but it's in many ways it's a fantastic example, isn't it, of something that really, to an awful lot of the sort of critical social theory of social science, is about how different people are treated in different contexts with different expectations. And actually, while on one hand you may be able to study the law as if it is some sort of natural written code that applies to all equally, in practice and in reality, we often don't see that play out. We see one rule for them and another for all of us. And
I think you're completely correct. And one of the first things I do when I get a new cohort and I'm teaching them, the first thing I tell them is, I say to them, what do you actually think about criminology? And then I spend the first 15 minutes telling them why it's an utter, I'm trying not to swear, but do you know what I mean? And I get them to think about, well, the law, who decides what a crime is, why can some people commit the same crime as others, or worse crime, and don't even feel that they, why is it, why is it all tipped in one direction? And and I've always said, think about it as it's a lot of the crime that we have, and a lot of the laws that we have, and the things that we class as criminal, is about middle class sensibility, and it's about controlling the working classes. And I think what's happened with COVID is the fact that we're being controlled. There is a bit more control, universal control, with the fact that people from the middle classes are now starting to feel, people white middle class normally don't feel the law, other than they can ring up and say somebody's been in my garden, and now they don't like that,
and some really dislike it. But what's interesting again, though, is if we go back to the early stages, and this is something that really kind of struck me, we had the passing into law of incredible powers for the state. Incredible powers, powers that had they been attached to a piece of legislation on or around terrorism, for example, would have created the most, a huge amount of critical comment, one would assume, and yet.
But the thing is, I think the reason why everybody is so quick to basically go along with all of this, to conform to is due to the fact that people are treating it like we're at war. And we're getting, and the way the language and the debate is framed is almost like we're at war, and it's like we are fighting an enemy. We have frontline staff. We have people stood there. That army generals standing there.
Well established the place where it's well established elsewhere is on crime. The war on drugs. We're going to declare war on organised crime. We're going to declare war on terror.
And all these wars are wars that nobody can win, because
absolutely.
It's like absolutely. And they need to sort of rephrase this properly. War on where we can get our oil from. War on getting our oil. War on students and black people. These are the wars that we're looking at. When you think about the war on drugs nicely coincided with the fact that the hippies were not really happy and were smoking some stuff and taking some pills because they didn't like you all going to war and napalming the crap out of other people. So let's start this nice war on drugs, because we don't want the students never know when to shut up. We can control people of colour and make sure we can put loads of them in the prison system, which is being highly, at that point, was being massively sort of privatised, and then if we go back to, and then if we go back to COVID now, and the amount of people in prison, they shouldn't even be there. And that's in the UK and in the States. We've got some of the highest prison, America's got the highest prison population. The UK is not that far behind, and it's like, we've locked people up for non-violent crime, and then they are in a situation where every single day is Russian roulette with their lives. They could contract COVID, or they're putting it on lockdown, so they're in the cell for 23 hours a day for what? Shoplifting? Or the fact, you could die. You could either die, or you would lock you up in solitary confinement for doing things that does not fit the crime. It does not fit the crime. Why are we doing this? We should have just let people out. We just don't. And we think about detention centres as well. Let's not just talk about prisons. What about Yarlswood? What about people that their only crime is wanting a better life or escaping oppression, that are locked up in places now under these conditions.
But but again, it's interesting, isn't it? Because, while some are very resistant to, for example, borders, quite quickly you recognise that the establishment of the border is perhaps necessary in the pandemic situation. So it's kind of interesting. One of the things that kind of came out about the government's response was, it didn't start to screen people arriving on aeroplanes until we were weeks into the kind of pandemic, which I thought was which makes no sense, and which I also thought was quite interesting, given that we've often been told that we've got we have control of it's so important that we have control of our borders. Well, we're facing a pandemic where people might be arriving with the illness. We didn't think to have any control of our borders, and I think again the interesting context for the UK, which is perhaps different to that in other parts of the world, is that COVID comes at a period where there's already the discussion about the break with the European Union and our place in the world, and I think there's something very, very interesting. The conversation we're not having, I think, in some ways, is around the kind of geopolitics of how things pan out after COVID. It's very interesting, isn't it, that the Trump administration in the US is quite clearly saying that this is the China virus, that they are already sort of pointing blame towards China. And
although he has been a mild source of entertainment for me with the whole, stick, let's ingest some bleach and shine a light up our place.
Well, I mean, and again, another one where I think it's so much we could talk about, because of course the other side of it is that both for the UK government and from elsewhere, one of the things that made me cringe the most about the injecting of bleach was watching Trump's scientific medical advisor sat to the side, trying to kind of keep her face as he was saying this, clearly thinking, oh my God, people are going to die because of this, And I saw an interesting article in our British Medical Journal just the other day, essentially sort of calling on the government scientific advisors, particularly as COVID restrictions were relaxed, and saying, well, what about you? How do you, as a scientific advisor, for example, cope with your conscience if what you're telling them doesn't accord with what they're doing? And of course, the other one on this, and it did cause me some amusement, was the tweet quickly deleted that came from the civil service Twitter account, which in England, which sort of said, can you imagine working with some of these truth twisters about the government, and when your own civil servants, and I know that there is an argument as well that the civil service should retain a degree of impartiality, and I recognise that, but there's so much kind of conflict being played out. It makes it very difficult, I think, I think
what I've also found difficult is the way the press have framed it. And it's almost like they're such a mouthpiece for it's like, the whole sort of, the science changed, and it comes to something when Piers Morgan becomes the voice of reason. I'm like, what is going on? I mean, obviously he's an opportunist. Let's not forget that. Sorry.
But he did once hack phones, phone hack. But yes, at the same time, yes. And I think in many ways, a lot of what we're seeing is perhaps, at a point where a lot of people, I think, had quite conveniently gotten into a phase of liking to split the world into black and white, good and bad, is in many ways all of the kind of nuances come rushing back in, don't they? You see all of the kind of complexities and the difficulties where,
I think it's another highlight for me was when Priti Patel was saying things like shoplifting had gone down. Rates of shoplifting was down compared to the year before. I'm like, wow, and it's like, no, crime is adapting, crime is evolving. People are still committing crimes, but they're doing it not in the same manner. People aren't shoplifting shops at a show,
I mean, some of those sort of adapting crimes are absolutely fascinating. From right the way from the sort of the sale of counterfeit pharmaceuticals over the internet, for example, and you know, organised crime getting into the sort of fake hand sanitizer business, for example, of fake face masks, but also you know, just on a smaller level, very quickly as well, it became quite apparent that for example, in the policing. In the initial stages, the police saw it as almost a sort of carte blanche to go out and target people who were involved in county lines drug supply. It became almost too easy for them to do their job, for example. So there's this sort of gather up the people who are still moving from London, you know, and we've got our drug dealers sort of thing. So there were lots of you know, there were lots of things playing out very quickly and very rapidly. I think that the likes of which we still haven't necessarily got to yet. But I suppose what's likely to be one of the sort of the big concerns that I think will loop back round at some point is, you know, to what extent was there a sort of negligence and a failure to act from the state that created, in some ways, you know, excess death. And I think particularly we may well see that come back about with care homes. And again, when we think of crime, we often tend to think of it being the bad acts of people. But actually, it may well be that, you know, in that omission, that failure to think about discharging people from hospital back into care homes was actually perhaps, you know, the worst act and one of omission and neglect that happened in terms of giving us in the UK now the highest recorded death rate in the world. I think
I do think there's going to be some people are going to have to answer some questions, but I just fear it's going to be another Grenfell. It's just going to be a case of or another Chilcot report. Well, they were a bit wrong on that.
And it may take, I think, you know, it may take a very long time to get answers to those questions, and we, you know, whether people necessarily are then held to account in a way that they would be, you know, had it been a sort of act of the individual, I think is very interesting. But at the same time, there is that there is also that, and I think perhaps a sort of place to come about towards sort of ending the discussion is that in some ways I was saying earlier on that there's been this sort of tendency at times to sort of suggest that we're all in it together and that, you know, the result is positive, but there's been a real kind of judginess.
It's so judgy. It reminds me of one of my favourite books, 1984. The very first pages where he's talking about the family across the hallway from it and how you know, they're always watching and stuff like that. And I do feel a bit like that. I do feel that this is what we're doing. Obviously, I'm not seeing a lot. I'm not on social media. I came off it for my own sanity, but I know a lot of my friends are telling me that, you know, you've got the selling pages are full of, my neighbour went out. They had somebody round. You know, Doris put the bin out twice today. You know, and it's almost like, and I know. I mean, somebody I know, they had their grandchildren round in the back garden, and the police were called and told them, you have to go home. You know, you know, and it's just, and it's like, but the person who did it was like, there's an ongoing feud there. So it's a good way if you don't get on with your neighbours. You know, they've gone out. You know, this whole people don't understand individual circumstances. Now, maybe if I've gone out all day, but in the early lockdown, walking down the street for hours at a time, not doing just 20 minutes exercise, maybe I'm escaping domestic violence. I'm not, by the way, just get that right. That didn't happen. Just disclaimer. But maybe I am walking down that street, escaping my home, because if I stay in it, I will become a statistic. You know?
And similarly, those assumptions work in a slightly reverse way at times as well, which is and it's an irony not lost on me at all, because I've seen, for example, quite a lot of suggestions that, you know, the people who are least compliant with lockdown are men aged 16 to, I think it's 34. You know, these are the people who aren't compliant, and you kind of go, no, those are the people that the police stop. And I've been going out very very little, for example. But I was struck on my, and partly because I was self-isolating from before the lockdown happened, because I actually don't know if I had COVID or not. Like most of the UK, I couldn't get a test, but certainly had the symptoms, so it was the responsible thing to do. I self-isolated. Only after sort of 3 weeks did I return back on to the local supermarket again. And then one of the things that really struck me is just how many people who were really quite old were out and about, going into the shops
Chatting away,
and chatting away. And so I talked to one of the shopkeepers about this, and she said to me, yes, the old folks, they're still in every day. It doesn't matter how much we tell them that they shouldn't be. It's part of their routine and their social activity, and they come to the shops every day. And we've even offered some of our regulars, the opportunity to have someone shop for them, and they won't do it.
Then you have stories on the other side, like the woman who was in her 90s that almost starved to death because she was too scared to leave her house, having no one to bring any food to her. So.
Absolutely. And I for one, having looked at my family, for example, find it very hard to believe it's just men in that age category who are the ones who have broken social distancing rules. I think if people were to be true, an awful lot of people have been breaking social distancing rules, an awful lot. And at least in part, that explains why the UK has a higher death rate. So it's all very well to sort of, to some extent, I'm not excusing the government.
Yeah, but I don't think people understood the rules.
You lot.
Yeah, but I don't think people understood the rules. That's the issue.
No,
it was so vague early on. Nobody knew what was happening. Amount of times I've had to Google stuff.
I think there
what does that actually mean?
If Dominic Cummings had gone, well, I drove to Durham because I wrote the rules and I can't bloody understand them, a lot of people would have gone, I'll buy that excuse.
Exactly. But if it's just a case of, but the memes have been fantastic. I mean, we could do a podcast just on the memes, because I'm sorry, but the memes of lockdown have been amazing.
There have been some very
look, contemporary history can be told through the meme.
Although there is also something that is quite strange about the fact, and this has happened both in the United Kingdom and in the United States of America, that one of the main memes to kind of symbolise lockdown is a black male porn star with that is shared and shared and shared and shared again. Which you kind of think, well, what's the connection of that? And again, when you think about the kind of the
meme generation, they have their own rules.
But again, if you think about that in the way that things are being kind of played out, because I mean, one of the things that certainly does seem to be the case is, what I think will result from COVID is already that sort of on high political endorsement of globalization as a sort of wider movement has already started to rescind towards a kind of new nationalisms that are kind of rising, particularly in the United States of America.
We're looking at political isolationism again.
Absolutely.
Because of it, I think things are going to change. We're going to have a lot of the powers that have been ubiquitously given to governments around the world, they're not going to want to let go of them anytime soon. I mean, they'll be restricted, there'll be easings of these powers, but at the end of the day, I mean, we've kind of just all sort of like blindly fell into 1984. Through
illness and pandemic and health, and one thing that does sort of come about is that of all the threats that you could kind of use to in some ways to create a compliant public, it's not a sort of authoritarian drive from on high as a we're against your interest, but we're looking after you. Is the way to do it, isn't it?
I mean, it's always that way. I mean, if you Gramsci, the velvet glove or the iron fist, at the end of the day, it's always going to be the velvet glove that gets us. If they come in with the iron fist, they're not going to be able to keep control, because eventually we'll be like, nah. But if you say, we've got your best interests at heart, and it's like any sort of like, it's almost like a societal gaslighting, although I hate to use the term societal gaslighting because obviously gaslighting it. But anyway, I'm going to use it anyway. And it's almost like that stroking of your hair. It's all going to be all right. We're looking after you. Do your job.
Yeah, and it takes us to a difficult point, really, in some ways, doesn't it? Where we don't really know if it's all going to be all right. I think the pandemic will pass, but what follows afterwards? Well, the future was interesting.
I think one of the laws that I read that I found interesting was that the changes as a law is that we used to have 2 doctors to sign a death certificate after Harold Shipman. Now it's back down to 1.
Yeah, no.
And on that note,
and on that note, thank you to all the NHS who are only ever good people. That is just another joke. By and large, our NHS staff are brilliant and wonderful, and I support them in every possible way. But I've
got friends who work in the NHS, and I know that they would prefer to have the proper equipment and have a decent salary rather than the claps.
Yeah, absolutely. But similarly, in the interests of nuance, we ought to point out as well, it is a setting that does kind of attract serial killers and psychopaths in some instances as well. Before we universally appraise, and similarly, I thought it was very interesting that at the same time the police were being highly praised in some ways for their handling of the pandemic and the difficult circumstances they were put in, and then Officer Derek Chauvin in the United States of America has changed that, not only for his colleagues in the US, but quite globally, it would seem to me as well. Which again, I think is why it's important that so we're not trying to take a particular line. We're just saying that it's interesting and there's far more going on here that we should question, and we should, more importantly, we should be allowed to discuss.
Yeah, people see it as a if you do ask the hard questions, if you do go, hang on a minute, that you're almost being disrespectful. But at the end of the day, that's just, as far as I'm concerned, that whole sort of disrespectful line is just a way of it's curtailing the debate, and I don't go with that. So I don't mind who I upset if I can open that dialogue and people can start looking at things with.
And that's the role that social sciences are supposed to do. And similarly, the one thing we haven't said that in the interests of balance may be important is it is a minority view at the moment, but there are some who are already saying that actually, lockdown in and of itself was to create a worse problem than allowing a model of isolating the vulnerable and continuing to allow free movement, and that the economic damage that has been wrought will have far longer consequences. So there are all sorts of different viewpoints.
Or the perceived economic.
Absolutely, because as we already said, economics can be used in quite
various ways. It's
absolutely.
And also, at the end of the day, we before lockdown, Boris Johnson's government was saying that they were coming out of austerity. Austerity was over. They were going to start injecting money back into society. Blah 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 blah. Hold on to your hats, people, because at the end of the day, this is giving them the ideological excuse to absolutely hammer us after this, because we've got to pay this back now. Sitting on your bum furloughed, because at the end of the day, we start off with this, like, please stay at home, blah, 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 blah. People who work in front lines on low wages are now heroes, but we're going to see a big switch around soon, very big switch around, because at the end of the day, the debate is going to be framed. I thought it'd be a while before they started blaming us for everything, but it only took a few weeks before it was like, oh, it's all your fault. It's because you go out. It's because you do this. It's like all these people on tubes, and it's like they're going to work because you've not made it clear to their bosses that they shouldn't be working.
Well, this is why we're still in interesting times. So we have got some more crime tapes planned. So we will come back to the format as well. And before we do, I will apologise, because every time I recognise that the little bit of light that seems to be escaping through my curtains makes me shine at times, like I'm, and I do apologise for that. We're trying to work some things out as we go along here, and we're in very, very interesting times for everybody. So in the past, Crime Tapes was recorded in a nice radio studio, part of the wonderful facilities at Staffordshire University. Obviously, at social distancing, Kyla is in her office, I'm in mine. I'd like to though thank Harriet, who's done a wonderful job in kind of bringing us together and uniting us to talk about this. And even though the world will look a little bit different, Crime Tapes will be back. We will find new ways to adapt and work as.
I think we've got another one planned anyway, haven't we?
We have got
like another one like this on the Tiger King. So.
We're getting. I love Tiger King so much that we could not do Tiger King. And then there will be more, because obviously we're watching what's happening in the United States of America at the moment, and there's a lot to talk about. And we may also be able to bring in some more interesting guests. So Crime Tapes is going to continue in a slightly different and changed format. So all that remains for me to do is to suggest that if you found this interesting, do please check out the website of Staffordshire University, where you can find out details about our courses on policing, criminology, social sciences, psychology, and law, and all manner of other subjects related to what we've been talking about today. International relations, anybody?
Politics,
history. So yeah, do indeed check out the website for Staffordshire University, and keep looking up Crime Tapes. Thanks very much.
Thank you.